I'm Jensen, the gallerist, and I would like to thank you all for coming to this talk, and especially thank Matt and Jacob Proctor from Brandhorst Museum for coming and agreeing to make this talk during the Berlin Gallery weekend. Thank you for coming, very welcome, and thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. So this will be fairly informal. For those of you, I think I would like to start out, most, if not all of your work for the last 15, 20 years has been especially involved with the history and the practice of film and cinema. And at first glance, this feels like a little bit of a step back from that, but then looking at it more closely, I think that we can still see a lot of aspects of kind of filmic qualities to the prints in this show. And I thought that might be an appropriate place to kind of start off.
I don't know if people are familiar with my earlier work, but
We don't have a slide presentation, unfortunately.
yes, I've often worked between cinema and painting and in different ways, and I think that my ideas of what that would mean have shifted over the years. From a kind of beginning was kind of unpacking sequences through painting as an activity of kind of engagement and drawing. And these sequential, serial sets of paintings based on photos I was taking off television. Then I started to think more about painting as a kind of time-based medium itself, and have been weaving work together with short animations, like the ones in the front. So I think there's been a way that process and kind of time-based media have come together in the paintings as a direct relationship to thinking about how moving images not only move but also kind of repeat and recycle themselves, and you can watch the same film over and over again. So there was, I don't know if this answers your question, but there was the origin of this project, I guess, was sort of unexpected and fast. I went to visit Niels. We were going to start something else, and I think we were kind of burned out and looked at each other and said, let's play around. But I had been working a lot with thinking about the transparency of different media, and that's something that really grew out of working with moving image, working with projections and projection screens where you can see them from both sides, and the image that was being projected would be caught by the materials at different times. So the last project we'd done together was a big set of giant copper plate etchings where we printed both the fronts and backs of the plates, and they were shown that way. So there was a sense of moving through to a front and a back. And so the idea here was just, I had this idea of using this material where the image would be in the fabric. So the way they're made, just really quickly, is I kind of built a frame, stretched a piece of fabric in the frame, and I painted watercolor on it, which of course just soaks all the way through the material. And then I put it in the printing press with a piece of wet paper folded in half over it, so that the wetness of the paper releases the watercolors. And what interested me was this idea of thinking about the image passing through the fabric and existing on both sides, but then a process that would capture them simultaneously. So there's a kind of shutter snap in which the front and the back are seen in the same instant, and both have a kind of sense of mirroring and rotation in the same moment. So I don't know if that's filmic, but there was an aspect of kind of activating this snapshot of both sides of this piece of material.
Yeah, and then I think that speaks very much to the presence of the animation in the show also, and maybe in the front-back kind of relationship, but also, what is the materiality of a projected image in relation to, this kind of absolutely, sort of very material quality of the montage.
Yeah.
I mean, what is that here? Why is that?
Hi, Scott. Well, I wanted to include the projection because I feel like, my processes for making work are often very matter of fact. They're almost always actually very lexical. There's never a lens, there's never a sleight of hand. But sometimes people get very far away from how they're made and are confused by that. So I actually started working with projection more intensely. Like this piece that the Brandhorst has was actually made for a show of color photographs that I thought needed this sense of light passing through the material in how the photographs are made, because they're made as kind of photograms of paintings, and was stretching the same type of material to make screens so you could see how light was passing through the screens in real time. It activated, I thought, some sense for the viewer of kind of unpacking some of the materiality. So I wanted to include a projection here. This was a short video that was part of a bigger installation in London last year. It has this very, very sheer fabric, and so it really was kind of the furthest extreme of transparency and doubling, having the image simultaneously twice in the sense that was very diaphanous, and so it felt like exactly where my head was when I was doing these things. Maybe an interesting extension of that is the last groups, the last couple of these I made were these really watery ones, and those came back to the way that I work on animations and I set up different materials, and I really sort of experiment in the studio with how much of the image catches and how much of the image passes through. So whereas some of the first monotypes here are the kind of Rorschach-y ones that were really about the sense of unfolding the ink shape. And then I started playing around with more folding the fabric itself across the seams. The image would be doubling or sort of folding onto itself. But the last ones were these ones where I was letting the watercolor dry more completely in some areas, and then making other areas very wet at the last minute, like literally just kind of pouring a glass of water onto the fabric, so that you end up with this flow that when it goes through the press, you end up with a motion of water from one end of the image to the other, which is like kind of like the passage of light. And some lines will hold, and some lines will give way. So there's a sense of catching the image, and some of it passes through, and some of it gets trapped, and the image kind of breaks and stays together at the same time.
With all of this doubling front and back and sort of kind of bilateral, almost symmetry of so many of them, it's interesting that you also, that these prints don't have the positive negative relationship that all of your photographic work does, or that like an Italian print does, in terms of a working process where you're actually painting what's, in many ways the inverse of what you're printing, and here it's a positive. And does that make the printing process feel more painterly in a way? Or?
Well, these are, I've been returning to drawing a lot, so actually I think these are drawings. I mean, they're prints. They're closer. That was the interest, because we had, when I set out to make a photograph, I make a painting in negative. So in some sense, I'm looking at a positive, I'm imagining the negative. There's a certain amount of kind of conversion and thought that goes on. I'm usually pretty careful about planning it out. And what I've been doing in the studio recently is making direct drawings with kind of resist on photo paper. So instead of working from an image, I'm working from my imagination, and I'm taking sheets of photo paper and painting oil paint on them, and then while it's still wet, pouring chemicals on it. So it's basically, the paint is acting as a resist to the water-based chemicals. So it's something that kind of moves in real time and is more intimately connected to my hand and imagination and work the last couple of years. And that's sort of how I approach these two, was to work very quickly and to set aside the source material a little bit. I mean, they're all from sources, and they all start with drawings that I'm making from photos. But in that sense, I guess they feel more raw. Draftsman.
But there isn't I mean, when I walked in, when I first saw the show, I thought that there was a kind of immediacy to, and the kind of corporeality of the body came out like very intensely for me right away. I mean, obviously it's something like this, but that it felt somehow less mediated through a kind of cultural lens of cultural production than usual. But then we started thinking about it more, and it's actually it also, they're so evocative of a kind of early 20th century or late 19th century kind of tradition of drawing or printing. I mean, I thought of Sheila or sort of late impressionist relationship to the body. Is that something is that totally off the wall, or?
No, I mean,
like there's that kind of erotics that isn't the erotics of the camera anymore, like, or the erotics of the cinema, that it feels somehow more bodily somehow.
Yes. I have two answers to that question, and they're two totally different answers. I mean, one is that, and I think I said this to you last night, that thinking about doing a show in Berlin, doing this presentation in Berlin, I was trying to think what was the most uncomfortable thing that I could do as someone who had lived here for a long time. And so I wanted to make a show that was very tender, maybe sentimental, erotic, self-revealing, and pink. So there was an aspect of returning, like the kind of body presence here was partly what I felt like would feel maybe the closest to some vulnerability. But there is a kind of more thinking answer to that, which is, so I'm teaching, and the body is a very contested space in American art right now. And so as someone who's worked with sort of mediation of bodies for a long time, in certain ways, it's a moment, it's like a lot of people turning over their assumptions. And there was a show in Philadelphia, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, of photography by impressionists, by second generation impressionists especially. There's a lot of photographic material, studio models that were photographed as source material for paintings, the camera being used as a tool. And so I kind of returned to this idea of this kind of pre-media mediated vision. It's like a first generation of still painters using the camera to see their subject matter instead of working live from the model or working live with the camera. And so there's actually a bunch of these prints from the series which we didn't show in this grouping because I kind of pulled them out because they felt were based on some of those photographs. But all the images here are all from, originally it was all media of the last year, but it then became things that I saw within the last year. It goes back to the 60s now a little bit. But I was really thinking about, when I went to Copenhagen, I was thinking about what bodies in media have moved me in the last year and how have I seen them, and then I tried to kind of recast them in this impressionist mode. I tried to cast them in this like slightly pre-modern or early modern space, imagining that we kind of erased all that history of film studies, and we're just looking at these bodies on television. I mean, these are mostly Twin Peaks, actually, and some not particularly highbrow sources, but they were just things I was looking at over the year. So yes, very specifically kind of flirting with the 19th century.
And you mentioned the pink, but I mean, the palette is also, I think quite striking. And I mean, was that something that you set out to make? A kind of colorist show, or was it something that just happened along the way?
Both. There's a lot of dirty water here. I mean, a lot of these kind of purples and these stains are just simply this. The earliest ones, I was printing the image, and then I would take the rag that I would take a piece of fabric and I would mop up all the leftover ink and and water off the palette and then just throw that into. So it's like there's no waste. Which is something in the last, this show I had in St. Louis, there was an animation that included all leftover paint from the canvases. This idea of a completely efficient
studio economy.
And that's where like some of these purples came from, is that there was so much paint in the figure, and Payne's gray, that the dirty water just went in that direction. And then I found that it was in the, maybe it's a wine. So.
There are a lot of nipples in this show also. I mean, is the torso, I mean, it is, it's, I feel like there's also, it's their torsos mostly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, was that just an accident, or is it that?
No, it's a play on words. It's torsion. I mean, it's not exactly, there were faces too, but I didn't, also, we pulled the faces out because they felt like they were getting into a different kind of psychology. And I've done a lot of psychology. You know, I wanted to think about, somehow the torso. I settled on these torsos, partially because of this thinking of double fronts and double backs. That I'm doing the front and the back, but then when you have a body, we've got, kind of reversible symmetry down this axis, but reversible symmetry on this axis. So I was interested in the way that those things could sort of turn in space, and make, or turn towards each other, or turn away from each other. And that was, I could do that with the whole body, but there's something very efficient about just the core.
Yeah, well, there's something that's very, I think efficient is a good word, but it's also something very kind of primal about it also, where it's such an immediately kind of, there's like a gestalt that like everyone will recognize the kind of general forms of, usually the face and the torso.
Yeah. I wish the gender was a little more confused.
Is there a way that this, actually maybe if you could back up a little bit and talk about sort of how printmaking in particular and the sort of how the kind of intricacies and particularities of the printmaking process function as a way of kind of mediating between other aspects of your work, which it seems like it kind of has been doing the last couple of years or a few years.
I think I have a pet peeve about painting. I really hate when painting is like a mark and then a mark and a mark. I think of painting as being something that has this ability to have a uncanny relationship between the parts and the whole. You can have this shift between sort of a micro scale and a macro scale. It can be very powerful. So I tend to gravitate towards things that have this level of being a kind of gestalt to them. And strive in painting to get to that type of space. And I think that printmaking, because of its passage through the press, because of this moment where something kind of leaves your hands and then you pick it up again. Even, I thought about this a lot before I started making prints in painting, I would think about kind of metaphorically tossing something in the air and catching it and seeing how it's landed in your hand when you've caught it. So that the whole move into using photographic processes for me was very much liberating in terms of the painting, because it created this cycle of working on something until you get to some closure where you feel like you've made your decisions, and then you move into another space. Suddenly this thing that was being made as a painting is just a tool to make a photograph, and it has a whole different set of strengths and weaknesses and possibilities there, and it kind of reboots the process. And I feel like printmaking does that naturally. And then the way that I've approached it with Niels really was to think of it as a space of remediation, to think of it as a kind of like a United Nations for all the different media I'm interested in. So when we first started working in prints, the first thing we did was work on mixtures of soap ground, which is it's basically mixing soap into the etching ground, which dissolves in the acid in a slightly unpredictable way, so it creates a kind of time release ground that blocks the acid. And so it had a kind of analogous relationship to photographic processing. There was a way that the acid was a kind of developer, and instead of the way you would normally build a print, which is through kind of layers of like you buy the state, and then you buy another state. We tried to make the whole thing almost all at once, or kind of get the whole image in this development. And that, I think, is indicative of the way that printmaking has kind of pushed and shifted my work, is that I'll take some idea from another medium and then try to do something, not to recreate the effect so much as make an analogous type of process in the materials of printmaking, and you get into other, it kind of opens up other territories.
Are there ways that, because you've also been teaching from print, with prints and the historical print collection a lot more over the last couple of years. Is there other ways that has influenced what you're doing in the print shop?
Well, I'm curating a show with Jennifer Roberts right now at the Harvard Museum around printmaking, but we're actually pulling a lot of anthropological stuff, kind of rubbings of temple sculpture, squeezes of Egyptian carving, and thinking about the space between kind of cast in a print and a photograph in a print. And especially with those temple rubbings, you have these conversions of three-dimensional space into two-dimensional space. In this very tactile way, or Jennifer's work with her rubbings of her father's objects. I think that thinking of wrapping around something or flipping all the way around has come up recently for me.
So we also were talking about earlier or yesterday about the sort of the way that prints. There's often there can be an ambiguity about whether the print is the reproduction or whether it's the model for a later. And just that print, and as you said, printmaking, prints broadly is one of the more kind of capacious kind of media categories. Right. But also there is that kind of temporal ambiguity often, at least in the history of printmaking, not necessarily in contemporary fine art, but that you have pattern books and you have documentations and copies and duplications. And just feel like there's a kind of circularity, or that printmaking becomes a place where a lot of different things kind of converge.
Well, it's a wonderful headspace of Jasper Johns, where he's making all his drawings after the paintings, and then the prints after the drawings, and then the paintings start to feel more like print tinkering than painting anymore. I don't know if that. The thing, the question of the original is an interesting one. I feel like things have gone into the prints and things have come out of the prints, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. I was very against making monotypes. I thought it was a dumb idea. So because in a way it's like, why would you make a monotype when you could make a painting? But besides this idea of having this idea of printing both sides at once, I realized that this connection between sort of liquidity and light that had become so central in the animation could be quite literal in the way that the transparency of the color could function in the print, where you could have, like, the water could carry the transparency and move the pigment around through the pressure of the press in a way that gravity or my hand or scrubbing could never do. So it becomes a kind of mechanical extension of a process or an idea you want to have, that you can extend these transparent watercolors so far with this level of pressure. And so it pushes the painting. It's like an extreme brush.
Did you get better? Did you feel like there was a certain, like the amount of chance involved that changed as you made them? Did you kind of figure out how to control it more, or did you let that kind of? No,
I mean, actually, I work faster when you feel more that you've got something. Once we started to have a number of prints where it felt like there were prints to be had, then it became this game. Like, I would ask Julie in the print shop to make more paper wet, and she would a huge stack of paper wet, and I would try to finish the whole, so that I try to burn through it all in one day. So by the end, I mean, they would leave, and then I would kind of get a pizza from the gas station, and then stay at night, and you're kind of drawing with one hand and printing with the other, and I feel like that's when it starts to, the space that opens up.
Should we see if there are there questions from the audience? Is that something that we can have time to?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I have a very simple question. What happens with the fabric afterwards? Because it must be quite interesting, no?
I've taken a few with me. There's some of them that actually that might be drawings. I just need to live with them and see, and the rest of them are wrapped up in Copenhagen in a box.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they're not reusable.
Well, they are. I mean, they
To what degree are they?
They hold a memory. I mean, it's less. If you do a monotype with a plexiglass plate or something like that, you really get cognates that kind of go forward pretty far. The fabric wants to hold on to the watercolor a little bit more, so you start to, after one or two impressions, you really don't get any more out of the little drawing, but it's there as a kind of template, so it becomes like re-inking the plate. It's like sort of tracing the old drawing. I think maybe more so than on a plexiglass plate, where you really are kind of moving around the drawing. Like it dries into the fabric and it stays there, so you can really see kind of many layers of the print. They get chunkier and stranger. You know, they get kind of as the drawings pile up, they get much less elegant.
Would you like to talk more about the video piece as well? I'm interested in some of the source materials I would talk about, and also the way in which you're working more and more with. We always think of screens and images being as flat, but this video has a real volumetric presence because of projecting through the screen. So, we'll hear a little bit more about the process.
Yeah, so I've been making these animated videos, which used to be very, very much based on fragments of narrative. They're often very related to the kind of stories of the show, and they've become more and more abstract for different. As I said, the last, the one I did with Marion in London and showed in St. Louis was really based on waste. It was just, there were all these passages, there were figurative passages, but there were these passages that were just all leftover materials. This one I made for a show in Shanghai, and it was a very long space, and I was thinking about this video that could unpack across several screens, and they lined up in such a way that there were, I think, 4 different channels on 4 different screens, but they were so transparent that some of each one would kind of get into the next one and the next one. So I was thinking about that, the video sort of collapses across a space. And it didn't quite work. It made a kind of dramatic scene, but that interaction between the screens didn't work. So I reworked it into this single screen thing where the wall just provides the counterpoint. So it creates that volume much more. The title of it is Painted Skin, which is a late King Hu film based on a Chinese ghost story where it's a woman ghost who's trapped in sort of limbo, and to be in the world she has to paint her, she has to use cosmetics to appear as a person. And so I was thinking about that kind of the cosmetic surface and the void behind in this kind of empty volume, so that what you see in the screen are passages where I'm making, I'm rolling out kind of big sheets of plastic in the studio and working, as I've done before, kind of working along them, thinking about the rhythm and the timing kind of in real space like this. But always with this idea that it's creating sort of surface in one level and surface in another level. Between them, there'll be some misalignment and some kind of space formed. And then there are a few, more carefully, like frame by frame drawn sections, which are sections of that film, and then landscapes from different films, because I was thinking about opening up this volume, and so some of the sections that appear very abstract are actually very quick, actually are rooted in very complicated landscapes, like a pan across a forest, or the bamboo scene in Touch of Zen. You would never recognize it in the film, but I was thinking about how there's such a hard line, I find, between when I'm working from a reference, letting yourself go into complete abstraction is very hard. So I feel like I'm always pushing from both sides to try to make a complete spectrum, but there's always a gap between the things that have reference and the things that are purely abstract. So because of the volume of the video there, I felt like there was this space to make a kind of, to push the landscape out of recognition, somehow it would reconstitute itself as a space, and that was very interesting. So, does that answer your?
Yep.
We're here, so we can turn off the camera and relax and have a more interesting conversation. But thanks for
Thank you all for coming and listening, and thank you to Matt for the show and for being so wonderfully forthcoming about it. So yeah, thanks.
I have one question which is very banal, I think. What pigment is the pink? What red do you use?
Rose Madder.
Rose madder. Okay, that's beautiful.
No, we asked Niels to direct me towards the art store in Copenhagen, and I tried to buy the most expensive watercolors I could find because they would have the best pigment
Yes,
quality. And,
the rose madder is pigment. It's not the brand.
No,
No,
it's brand is, I mean,
It's a schmink.
the same pigment
Yeah.
will be different from
Yeah,
brand
yeah.
to brand anyway.
Okay, that's good. But rose madder has a certain quality.
yes.
Thank you.
There's a, I mean, I swear by the Old Holland Catholic Rose Antique, which is it's beautiful transparent rose. And then they make this color called neutral clear, which I picked up because I just liked this idea of working with a color which said like neutral, no personality, whatever it says. And it's the most beautiful kind of transparent grayish purple. So I was sort of, I think, operating in those kind of in that oil painting palette, or trying to find it in watercolor. Nice shopping. It's more than you asked.
Yes.
I think we should
Yeah.
go off the book.
Thank you
but
so much.
anybody's welcome.